July 20th, 1969. It's a date we remember, instinctively, a real turning point for humanity. That unimaginable distance between Earth and the Moon. It just collapsed in a single step. Breathtaking. For so many of us, that image of Neil Armstrong's boot print, it's etched into our collective memory. It felt like a unifying triumph, broadcast across the globe, 500 million people watching, holding their breath, for something that felt like it changed everything. But what if that moment, that defining moment, that incredible leap of faith and engineering, what if it had ended differently? Not in awe or triumph, but in silence, static, profound disappointment. Apollo 11 was the boldest, probably the most dangerous technological effort in human history up to that point. But what if it faltered? Right there, during the descent? What if the Eagle never landed? That's the question. The central what if for this episode. A scenario with ripples, deep, far-reaching ripples. Because it's not just about one failed mission. It's about a world where that moon landing, that milestone, never happened. Where the phrase, "we choose to go to the moon," isn't remembered as a triumph of human resolve, but as a haunting promise never fulfilled. And suddenly, that moment of failure challenges a core belief. That bold ambition leads to greatness. Because sometimes it doesn't. In this alternate reality, the stars are still out there, still shining just as brightly, but no one ever truly proved we could reach them. To understand what that world looks like, we need to go back, set the scene, build the alternate timeline. Context is everything. Imagine America in 1969, a nation divided, the Vietnam War raging overseas, civil rights protests erupting at home. The country was convulsing, angry, uncertain, desperate for direction, and more than anything, it needed a win. Something spectacular, something unifying. A moment to remind the world and itself that the American experiment still had momentum, still had ingenuity, still mattered. Apollo 11 was supposed to be that moment. It was conceived as a unifying force, a towering display of American exceptionalism, a moonshot in every sense of the word. 3 men, strapped into a colossal rocket, launched by a nation locked in a Cold War race to conquer the final frontier. Years of relentless work led to this point. NASA engineers living on caffeine and sheer will, pushing boundaries, redefining limits. Billions of taxpayer dollars invested in a mission as audacious as it was fragile. And the astronauts? Their training was brutal. Every contingency drilled, every failure simulated, including the ones no one wanted to talk about. Then came July 16th, 1969. The world watched in awe as the Saturn V roared off the pad, a thunderous exclamation of human ambition. And for 3 straight days, everything went flawlessly. Every system, every calculation. Just getting a spacecraft into lunar orbit, the complexity alone was staggering. Armstrong and Aldrin prepared the lunar module, the Eagle, for descent, already a triumph of engineering. The spacecraft entered orbit without error. Systems were green. The world was holding its breath. And then, something went wrong. At the most critical moment, during the final descent, a failure struck. This is the divergence point. Picture it. The Eagle beginning its final approach. Tension thick enough to cut in mission control. Maybe it was a faulty sensor, corrupted data thrown into the guidance system, or a pressure leak, microscopic, undetectable, until it crippled a vital component. Maybe it was the communications array, or the primary guidance computer itself, failing at the worst possible moment. Suddenly, numbers spike. Alarms flash red. Across the consoles in Houston, panic simmers beneath professionalism. And then the truth sets in. The landing can't happen. The Eagle can't descend safely. The call is made. Abort. It's crisp, unyielding. Armstrong and Aldrin, just hours from stepping onto the lunar surface, begin the painstaking, complex process of powering the module back up. Training takes over, instinct kicks in, but history doesn't. Their voices stayed calm, trained, measured, every syllable delivered with practiced precision. But underneath it all, an unspoken weight clung to every word they transmitted. They knew what it meant. Not just for themselves, not just for their mission, but for the entire world watching. They'd return to Earth as heroes, sure. They faced danger. They survived. But not as legends. Because in this timeline, Apollo 11 isn't a story of glory. It's not a page in the epic of history. It becomes something else entirely. A story of courage, of effort, of technical success, but not of victory. The American flag is never planted. That plaque, "We came in peace for all mankind," never touches lunar soil. It's left behind, tucked away in some NASA storage vault, forgotten, gathering dust. And those iconic footprints, the ones seared into our collective imagination, they're never made, because the Eagle never landed. And if the United States doesn't land on the moon, if it comes that close, and still fails, the implications are seismic. At first, the public reels in confusion, uncertainty. What happened? Was it delayed? News anchors scramble, relying on vague phrases, technical difficulties, safety precautions, mission adjusted. The real cause, whatever the failure was, gets buried. Sanitized press briefings, delayed statements, NASA doing its best to manage the fallout, but the world feels it. That gut punch of disappointment, that collective sense that something extraordinary just slipped through our fingers. And the space race? The one that began with Sputnik? It suddenly feels unwinnable for America. Or at least, its boldest gamble has ended in bitter defeat. This single failure, this one moment, sends shockwaves. It doesn't just alter the mission, it reshapes everything. The course of space exploration, the political climate, national ambition, even the dreams of kids staring up at the stars, because the Eagle didn't land, and the world would never be quite the same. Let's pause there and think about the global resonance, that shared anticipation on July 20th, 1969. Roughly 600 million people watching, across continents. Cafes in Paris rolled out televisions. Families in Tokyo stayed awake into the early hours. School children in Ghana gathered around radios. Even in the Soviet Union, behind the Iron Curtain, officials monitored the feed. This wasn't just an American moment. It was framed as a planetary milestone. The first time any life form was supposed to step onto another world. So what did that moment of failure feel like? Agonizing. The broadcast flickers. The signal stutters. The screen freezes. News anchors glance nervously off camera. NASA's feed cuts in and out. The calm voice of mission control replaced by static, then by whispers, then maybe faint arguments, barely audible in the background. And around the world, silence. Millions of people waiting for the words that never came. Exactly. Tranquility base here. The Eagle has landed. Those words are never heard. No triumphant descent footage. No giant leap for mankind. Just a terse, devastating announcement, slowly filtering through. Due to a critical systems anomaly, the lunar module has been ordered to abort descent. The astronauts are safe. No landing attempt will be made. The line between success and failure was razor thin, invisible to the global audience. But the effect? Immediate. A profound anticlimax. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins are alive. Their professionalism, impeccable, unshakable, even under the crushing weight of what had been lost. But the fundamental truth remains. No human feet touched the moon. Not that day. And maybe people begin to wonder. Maybe never. NASA's carefully constructed narrative starts to fray instantly. Reporters, sensing the magnitude of the failure, begin asking hard, pointed questions. Congressional aides scramble. Scientists at Mission Control pore over every log, every scrap of telemetry, searching for the root cause. It might have been a technical failure, but the impact? Profoundly human. Billions of dollars, years of preparation, hundreds of thousands of brilliant minds, all converging on a single historic moment that never arrives. That vanishes into a quiet void. Officially, it's labeled a success. The crew returned safely. But no one was watching for a safe return. They were waiting for the flag, the footprint, the dream made real. Instead, they got silence. And that silence travels fast, all the way to Capitol Hill. The knives come out, quickly. Congress, already wary of the ballooning costs, begins questioning the entire space program. Social unrest, poverty, civil rights battles at home. And now this? The moon mission becomes a symbol of misaligned priorities. Public sentiment, once white-hot with pride, cools rapidly. There's still a ticker-tape parade, but it's shorter, muted. A shadow of what it could have been. A haze of disappointment lingers in the air. TV stations replay the moment of failure again and again, the abort announcement becoming a symbol, not of American glory, but of overreach. And on the global scoreboard, the momentum shifts. The pressure lands squarely on President Nixon. In our timeline, the moon landing was a Cold War knockout punch, the U.S. reclaiming dominance after Sputnik, after Gagarin. But here, that punch never lands. The Cold War scoreboard tilts, hard, back toward the Soviet Union. America loses what could have been its most iconic victory. It looks hesitant, overextended, vulnerable. American technological supremacy takes a hit, a severe hit. Allies begin to quietly question America's edge. Rivals sense something else entirely, weakness, maybe even blood in the water. And the Soviets? They move fast. Oh, the Soviets respond immediately and mercilessly. Just 3 days before Apollo 11 was scheduled to land, they had quietly launched Luna 15, an unmanned probe designed to collect lunar soil and return it to Earth. In our timeline, it crashed. But in this one, where Apollo never lands, Luna 15 becomes a propaganda triumph. Even if it still fails its landing, the Soviet state media reframes the story. With ruthless precision. Capitalist crash, socialist success. That kind of messaging. They proclaim that the USSR was the first to interact with the moon's surface, boots or no boots. And they launch a full-scale PR blitz across Europe, Asia, Africa, South America. The message is simple. Soviet consistency triumphs over American spectacle. And it works. Nations in the non-aligned movement, already skeptical of American dominance, begin to tilt ever so slightly toward Moscow. In diplomacy, in trade, in ideology, it proves what geopoliticians already know. Perception often matters more than performance, especially when there's a vacuum of perceived success. So, what does President Nixon do? He's only 6 months into his presidency. In our reality, he masterfully used the moon landing to position himself as a calm, capable leader, guiding America through its proudest hour. He even had a disaster speech drafted, just in case. But he never needed it. Here, there's no glory, no triumphant photo op. Instead, Nixon is the president welcoming home astronauts, not as pioneers, but as survivors of a mission that failed. His approval rating takes a hit, a sharp one. His core policy focus, peace with honor in Vietnam, becomes even more urgent and even harder to achieve without the moon landing as a positive counterweight. The glow of national pride, gone. His administration starts to look mired. War, inflation, scandal. Without the unifying boost from Apollo 11, Nixon leans harder into domestic reforms, environmental policies, economic tweaks. But the absence of that lunar success hangs over everything. Inside the White House, staffers are quietly uneasy. Did America miss its moment? Speechwriters quietly shelve the phrase, spacefaring nation. Internally, the frontier of space begins to look less like a promise and more like a problem, a political liability, a drain, a public disappointment. And NASA? The blow is devastating. Even in our reality, after the moon landing, NASA's budget was slashed in the 1970s. Congress figured the mission had been accomplished. But here, after a very public failure, the cuts come faster, deeper, vital programs are gutted, the political will collapses overnight. Taxpayers feel duped, $25 billion spent, and nothing to show for it. The consensus in Washington shatters. Within days, congressional hearings begin. The scrutiny is immediate and intense. Senators start asking hard questions. Should Apollo 12 or 13 even happen? NASA administrators are hauled into hearings, grilled about safety, budget, overruns, accountability. The tone is sharp, relentless. And in a time already racked by social unrest, inflation, and the quagmire of Vietnam, space exploration begins to look less like a proud endeavor and more like a costly indulgence, a distraction America can't afford. NASA is forced to scale back. Lunar missions are paused indefinitely, or in some cases canceled outright. Those ambitious plans for Mars missions in the 1980s? Quietly shelved. Reduced to footnotes in internal reports. Research budgets are slashed across the board, and the talent? The engineers, the scientists, the dreamers who once saw NASA as a beacon of national purpose, they begin to leave, one by one, looking for stable earthbound jobs in the private sector. The momentum, once unstoppable, slows to a crawl. NASA, once the embodiment of American imagination, a blend of math, metal, and myth, is left reeling. The failure of Apollo 11 doesn't just dim the energy, it dissipates it entirely. In the chaotic months following the aborted mission, NASA's leadership scrambles. The original roadmap had been so clear: land Apollo 11, then build. Apollo 12, 13, increasingly complex missions laying the groundwork for permanent lunar infrastructure, rovers, habitats, maybe even a stepping stone to Mars. But in this timeline, none of that happens. Public support for human spaceflight collapses, the funding dries up, and the language shifts. Gone is the bold talk of destiny and flag planting, replaced by terms like damage control and cost efficiency. Humanity's dream among the stars becomes remote. NASA pivots to what it can still do: missions that require no humans, no risk, data gathering, remote sensing, science by proxy. The new goal isn't inspiration, it's stability, quiet victories. And, to be fair, they still happen. The Voyager probes likely still embark on their legendary journey. Pioneer missions continue. Weather satellites revolutionize our understanding of the Earth's systems. These are real achievements, but they're not headline grabbers. They don't draw 600 million eyes. They don't echo through history. And the space shuttle? That was meant to be the next giant leap. A reusable spacecraft, the workhorse for space stations, maybe even a launch pad for a moon return or missions beyond. But with Apollo's legacy tarnished, the shuttle program loses its urgency. Its political champions disappear. Funding dries up. Congressional interest fades. Delays pile up. In our world, the first shuttle launched in 1981. Here, that timeline drifts to the late 80s. Maybe, or maybe it launches once. A quiet proof of concept, then gets shelved. A political gesture, not a foundation. And this lack of big, inspiring public effort, it bleeds into private space as well. Because without a moon landing to point to, without that definitive proof that humanity can pull off the impossible, space stops looking like an opportunity. It starts looking like a money pit. And the visionaries? They go elsewhere. The people who might have founded SpaceX or Blue Origin in the 80s or 90s, they don't end up in space. They go into computing, biotech, defense, anywhere but the stars. There's no SpaceX in this world, no Blue Origin, no satellite internet boom, no bold new race to colonize Mars. The commercial space age, as we know it, never lifts off. And Cape Canaveral, the place where history was supposed to be made, it becomes something else, something quieter, almost mournful. It transforms into little more than a government outpost, careful, bureaucratic, and increasingly nostalgic. Sure, the visitor center still opens. Kids still come on field trips, wide-eyed. Retired engineers give tours pointing to launch pads and blueprints, telling stories about where dreams once lived. But the aura is different now, less electric, more archival. It feels like a museum before its time. The flame of Apollo burns only in pockets, in the memories of stubborn engineers, in dusty textbooks, in rarely replayed footage buried deep in the archives. And there's real tragedy in that. Because Apollo wasn't just metal and circuitry. It was infrastructure built on hope, on vision. A scaffold for everything that could have followed. Lunar bases, Mars colonies, permanent outposts. All gone. Not because it was impossible. Not because we lacked the technology. But because one moment, one missed landing, shook the foundation so violently that no one had the will, or the funding, or the unified dream to rebuild. So what rises in its place? Satellites. Earth imaging improves. Meteorology advances. Global communications become faster, clearer. These are real gains, tangible benefits. But they're small steps. Small steps in a world that never took the one. That's the legacy of a failed Apollo 11. An agency forced to recalibrate its ambition downward. A public that turns its gaze inward. A launch pad growing quiet. A generation of engineers left with the bitter knowledge that they got so close and still didn't make it. The infrastructure survives, just barely. But it no longer points toward the stars. It points laterally, sideways. It keeps Earth in sharp focus, while the moon fades back into myth. And that NASA recalibration? It echoes into the military too, because space was always strategy in the Cold War. Always. Rockets didn't just lift payloads. They sent messages. Messages of dominance, of reach, of deterrence. And when the US fails to land Apollo 11, the message to Moscow is chillingly simple. The Americans blinked, and the Soviets pounce. They'd been watching NASA's progress with anxiety, behind in manned lunar missions, but ahead in others. Lunar probes, their Venus program. And now, with America stumbling, the path is clear. Soviet leadership seizes the moment. They pivot. The moon is no longer the only prize. Venus, Mars, those become the new frontier. The Soviet space program retools fast. More sophisticated interplanetary probes are approved, not just for science, but for projection, for presence, for pride. Missions like Venera, Mars Andra fast-tracked. Even when they fail, they're framed as fearless attempts. Moscow's message is loud, simple, powerful. We are pushing forward. We are unafraid. We are the future. And back in Washington, the U.S. military quietly shifts its focus. Downward, downward. That's where the focus shifts. Vietnam is bleeding money and lives. The moon landing is off the table. Congress grows impatient, skeptical of high-cost programs that offer no direct strategic advantage. NASA loses its leverage. And the military steps in, not to save exploration, but to repurpose space as a battlefield. A vantage point. Suddenly, orbit isn't about dreams. It's about dominance. Funding moves sharply, away from spacecraft toward missile tech, away from space stations toward spy satellites. The vision narrows, hardens. Orbit becomes a domain of surveillance and deterrence. Instead of exploring new worlds, the United States begins investing in programs like Corona and KH-9, Hexagon, vast reconnaissance systems, early warning platforms tied to NORAD. These aren't side projects anymore. They're the center of America's space strategy. And the culture of space changes with it. Astronauts stop being explorers. They're no longer modern Magellans or ambassadors of the human spirit. They're assets, instruments, extensions of military will. The language of space shifts. No more wonder, no more discovery, no more humanity. Now it's about surveillance, targeting, payload capacity. The dream of walking on distant worlds gives way to the cold logic of orbital supremacy. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, cosmonauts are elevated, celebrated, national celebrities, symbols of socialist might, even there. Failures are reframed as progress, minor victories amplified into global statements. And in the US, public interest collapses. Kids grow up knowing more about missile silos than moon craters. Recruitment into aeronautics plummets. NASA's prestige dims. The Department of Defense, its budget, its reach, expands. And what about the promises of peace in space? The Outer Space Treaty? Harder to enforce. Trust evaporates. Both sides assume the other is developing weapons in orbit. The Cold War climbs into the sky. An arms race begins. Satellites spy on satellites. Signals are jammed. Secret tests run in silence. Strategic ambiguity becomes the norm. By the late 70s, the stars aren't destinations. They're tactical real estate. Places to watch from, maybe to strike from. That dream of peaceful cooperation, like the Apollo-Soyuz handshake of 1975. It never happens. No handshake. Just that cold, lingering question. What if the first flag planted on another world didn't bear a scientific emblem, but a military logo? Because the moon, it was never just a rock. It was a mirror, a beacon, a symbol in the sky that said we could reach higher, together. In our timeline, 1969 wasn't just a victory for America. It was a step for humanity. Armstrong's bootprint was proof that science could transcend war, that exploration could unite where politics divided, that Earth, for a moment, could look upward and believe. But in this world, that never arrives. The moon remains untouched. The dream stays unrealized. And culture? It shifts, profoundly. That optimistic vision of the future, the one carefully built through the 50s and 60s, it starts to unravel. Science fiction feels it first. Stories from that golden age, Star Trek 2001, A Space Odyssey, were hopeful. They imagined a future led by wisdom, curiosity, and peace. A future that felt just around the corner. But without the moon landing, those stories lose their edge, their urgency. They drift from prophecy back into fantasy. They stop feeling like previews and start feeling like escapism. Which brings us to 2001, A Space Odyssey. When 2001, A Space Odyssey is re-released in the early 70s, it doesn't feel visionary anymore. It feels like a lost timeline. Reviewers call it beautiful, but unrealistic. The space station, the moon base, the voyage to Jupiter, they're no longer just steps away. They're impossibilities now, dreams from a world that could have been. And the culture follows. Writers turn cynical, filmmakers get darker. Movies like Silent Running, Dark Star, Solaris, they don't show humanity rising. They show it breaking, under pressure, under failure, not reaching the stars but collapsing under its own weight. Even Star Trek, still beloved, starts to feel quaint. A utopian fantasy in a universe Earth never even got the keys to. And this disillusionment, it's not confined to theaters. It's felt in classrooms, in homes, deeply. Kids look at the moon and don't see a place we conquered. They see a place we couldn't reach, not because we weren't brave, Not because we weren't brilliant, but because something, money, politics, miscalculation, got in the way. That sense of possibility? It dims. Enrollment in aerospace drops. The glamour fades. Astronomy becomes academic, not aspirational. The kids who might have built rockets start building financial models instead, or code, or court cases. Being an astronaut goes from dream job to punchline. And the moon, it becomes poetic again, mysterious, not a goal, a metaphor, something for lovers and dreamers, not explorers. Even spirituality is affected. In our world, the moon landing became a moment of shared awe. Pope Paul VI watched it live. Pastors spoke of creation's majesty. Muslims admired the courage, a rare moment that transcended faith, culture, and language. Here, there is no such moment, no spark, no unifying glimpse of the divine. We stay in our corners, fragmented, grounded, looking down instead of up. Art reflects this shift. Lunar paintings disappear, music turns inward. The bright optimism of space-age pop gives way to the raw edge of punk. Postmodernism rises. Rebellion replaces aspiration. Style overtakes substance. That dream of a united human future? It starts sounding like the punchline of an old ad campaign. Quaint, unreachable. A whole generation grows up under that cloud. Not worse, just heavier, less enchanted, more skeptical of grand goals. They inherit color TVs, satellites, and early computers, but grow up under a ceiling, not a sky. They see the moon, but only as a reminder of what we tried to do and didn't. The distance becomes more than physical. It becomes emotional, cultural, spiritual. And in that space, between what could have been and what was, we lose something immeasurable. The belief that the future wasn't just coming, but that we could shape it, transcend our limits, reach the unreachable. So let's talk about global influence and innovation. Because in the Cold War, space was never just about rockets. It was soft power, symbolism. The moon landing would have been the ultimate expression of democratic ambition, innovation triumphing over authoritarian control. But it didn't happen. So who fills the void? The Soviets, decisively. They already had the firsts, first satellite, first man, first woman in space. Now, with Apollo 11's failure, their legacy shines even brighter by contrast, unchallenged, uncontested. And Brezhnev knows it. He pushes the narrative hard. Soviet space victories become national spectacles. Luna missions are rebranded as heroic. Venera probes to Venus are promoted as bold frontiers of exploration. Even when missions fall short, it doesn't matter, because the perception is shifting. And perception in geopolitics is power. Non-aligned countries start to take notice. They see Soviet planning not just as competent, but as futuristic. The USSR begins to influence more than just geopolitics. It shapes imagination. Textbooks in India, Egypt, Brazil feature Soviet space imagery. Cosmonauts are cast not as warriors, but as destiny's heirs, symbols of what comes next. And while the Soviet surge continues, international space efforts lag. In our world, the moon landing inspired momentum. The formation of the European Space Agency, Japan's NASDA, eventually China's CNSA. The belief was space was open, a shared frontier. But here, that belief fades. ESA forms later, more cautiously. Japan turns inward, prioritizing economics. China, so fascinated in our reality, decides space just isn't worth the cost. Yet, global investment in space becomes conservative, hesitant. The collective will to reach out slows. And then, there's Earthrise, that iconic Apollo 8 photograph. In our timeline, it struck like lightning. Earth, seen from the moon, fragile, radiant, alone. It launched the modern environmental movement, gave us perspective, gave us cause. But here, It exists. But without the moon landing, its impact is diluted. It's just a photo. It doesn't capture the imagination, doesn't become a symbol, doesn't hang in dorm rooms or inspire legislation. That emotional anchor for environmentalism, that moment of planetary unity, never quite materializes. NASA's global brand as a cultural force weakens. Sure, America still exports music, movies, tech, but not awe, not wonder. It lacks that symbolic capital of having touched another world. And critics start to ask the uncomfortable question: if the US couldn't land on the moon, can it really lead the future? Quietly, other voices grow louder. European philosophers, Soviet scientists, Chinese engineers. The American monopoly on vision starts to crack. It doesn't collapse, it just stalls. The world becomes more hesitant, more fractured. Without that giant leap, Earth stays a little smaller, a little quieter, a little more divided. And it's easy to forget, for you, listening now, how fragile progress can be. Look around today. Electric cars, commercial rockets, GPS, smartphones. It feels like technology just happens, like forward motion is inevitable, but it's not. So much of it came from sparks, moments, symbols, and the moon landing may have been the brightest of them all. So what happens when that spark never ignites? Well, science still moves forward, but it walks. It doesn't run. Without the momentum of Apollo, public appetite for bold, risky research fades. NASA's extraordinary funding dries up. That cascading investment into high-tech infrastructure, lost. Politicians stop seeing science as the path to prestige. The Cold War shifts underground, into black ops, intelligence, missile silos, not telescopes, not trans-lunar trajectories. Science returns to the lab, not the launch pad. Progress slows. Take microchips. The Apollo guidance computer pushed integrated circuits to the edge, forced companies to make them smaller, faster, cheaper, more reliable. That pressure seeded the PC revolution. But here, without Apollo's massive demand, that industry grows slower. Research takes longer. Costs stay higher. Innovation becomes cautious. Personal computers don't arrive in the early 80s. Maybe not until the late 80s. The internet matures in the 2000s, not the 90s. Whole industries wait years longer to go digital. Same goes for satellite tech. Without that competitive fire, the moon landing as a catalyst, the pressure fades. The breakthroughs slow. There are fewer launches, simpler missions, lower stakes. Weather satellites lag, GPS. It stays locked behind military protocol, an experimental tool with limited range and little commercial push. Without Apollo's momentum, it remains just that, a Cold War project, not something that powers your phone. And speaking of phones, mobile tech needs that satellite backbone. Without it, the evolution is slower, less connected, less global. In material science, the story's the same. So much innovation came from the need to keep humans alive in space. Composite materials, thermal insulation, fire-resistant fabrics, coatings that withstand extreme radiation, even medical adhesives used in surgery. Many of those were born from solving problems Apollo posed. Without Apollo, those problems don't rise to the top. They're not priorities. Innovation still happens, but it's later, less urgent. Some discoveries might not happen at all. And the talent pipeline? It changes dramatically. After Apollo in our world, STEM enrollment soared. A whole generation said, "I want to build that." Careers were born from Armstrong's step. NASA became a beacon. But here, that beacon flickers. Students lose interest. Fewer apply to engineering, physics, aerospace. Ambition pivots inward, toward safer fields, business, law, finance. America still produces scientists, but not in the same numbers, not with the same fire. That spirit of applied science, of doing the impossible, becomes niche, not national. So by the late 1980s, the world still looks advanced. but it feels less inspired. Like we've inherited a future we didn't quite earn. Yes, technology solves problems. It makes life more convenient. But it stops asking the big questions. Can we live on other worlds? Can we go farther? What's waiting out there? Those questions fade. Because if the first step never happened, it's hard to imagine the next ones ever will. Progress becomes practical, efficient, necessary, but no longer bold. And that phrase, space-age technology, it doesn't mean the same thing anymore. Because there was no true space age. Just a few launches, a few satellites. Then, silence. The future still comes, but it feels smaller, like we missed our chance to stretch it a little farther, to make it more magnificent. And here's a powerful thought experiment for you, listening now. Would people like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos have ever launched rockets if they hadn't grown up watching the moon landing? It's a fascinating question, because both were born into a world shaped by Apollo, a generation soaked in space culture, magazines, documentaries, models, lunchboxes. NASA astronauts weren't just pilots, they were heroes. Science fiction met reality. And the world watched. And the specifics matter. Bezos has openly credited the moon landing as his spark. He named his company Blue Origin, funded the recovery of Apollo 11's engines. He once said, "You don't choose your passions. Your passions choose you." And all of us who grew up watching Apollo, we were chosen by space. Musk, born in 1971, devoured science fiction. He watched those documentaries. He wondered why we weren't back on the moon. His disillusionment fueled SpaceX. But here's the catch. That frustration only works if the moon landing happened in the first place, if there's a lost glory to chase, if there's a bar to exceed. No landing, no foundation to rebel against, no disappointment to ignite a vision. So in this alternate timeline, that spark, it never lights. Musk might still be brilliant, but focused elsewhere. AI, electric cars, infrastructure. Bezos might still build a tech empire, but without that deep emotional pull from space. Because it was never just about rockets. It was about symbols. And thousands of engineers, coders, designers. They didn't just join aerospace for the paychecks. They joined because Apollo proved something. It proved it could be done. Without that proof, without the moon landing, the energy never enters society's bloodstream. So maybe Blue Origin never lifts off. Maybe SpaceX never forms. Maybe the commercial space race we see today doesn't happen. Not for decades. Maybe not at all. And that absence, it creates a vacuum. So what about China? Would they lead lunar exploration by default in this version of history? Highly likely. In our reality, the China National Space Administration, CNSA, was founded in 1993. It watched the US and Soviet Union closely. Then, in the 2000s, it made space a priority. Astronauts, a modular space station, and in 2019, a landing on the far side of the moon. An extraordinary achievement. Now imagine that playing out in a world where the US never landed on the moon. China doesn't view itself as catching up. It sees a void, a missing legacy, and more reason to step forward, even more reason. In this world, lunar leadership becomes more than prestige. It becomes a defining statement about humanity's future in space. China wouldn't just be competing, it would be leading the narrative. Probably earlier, more focused, free from Cold War baggage. Their message wouldn't be about beating someone. It would be about becoming the first to claim peaceful development, the first to mine lunar resources, the first to build a permanent moon base. And, because the United States lacks that iconic milestone, China's vision carries more weight. Diplomatic influence, scientific prestige, global soft power, especially among developing nations. The torch isn't passed from one superpower to another. It's passed from one era to the next, with a new leader setting the pace for the moon. Which brings us here to one final question. Do we still believe in giant leaps or only incremental steps? Because in our world, the moon landing changed everything. It changed how we talked about possibility. It gave us the term moonshot, made the impossible feel reachable, taught us that humanity, all of us, could do anything we set our collective mind to. But in this world, without that moment, without that leap, the world defaults to caution, to skepticism, to smaller visions. The phrase giant leap for mankind is never spoken, never becomes a cultural touchstone. For ambition, breakthroughs still happen, of course they do. Human ingenuity is relentless. But the big ones? They come slower, approached with more hesitation, less appetite for risk. Culturally, change becomes gradual, not transformative. Progress is managed, not chased. Controlled, not leapt toward. You see it in policy, in corporate investment, in how we teach science. Innovation becomes refinement, not revolution. So maybe we still get to Mars, to AI, to fusion, but the road there is longer, slower, dimmer. And that feels right. Because without Apollo 11, without that singular unifying moment, we never proved we could jump. We never took that initial breathtaking leap that redefined our shared sense of what's possible. Every nation has its myth, a story it tells itself about who it is. For the United States, that myth was exploration, the frontier, pushing outward, from sea to shining sea, from wilderness to orbit, from the Wright brothers to Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. Apollo 11, in our history, was the summit of that myth. The moment the idea of American greatness became tangible, a boot print pressed into dust 384,000 kilometers away. But in this timeline, that moment never comes. And the myth? It breaks. It breaks. The story of American exploration doesn't crash. It just stops. No catharsis. Just a missing final act. And that absence? It leaves a mark, a deep one. Kennedy's "We choose to go to the moon" speech. It still exists, still gets quoted. But in this timeline, it lands differently. In our world, it was a promise kept. Here, it becomes a haunting echo. Ambition without achievement. A confident declaration with no fulfillment. A headline with no story underneath. So in the decades that follow, American leadership in science and tech, still significant, but no longer unquestioned. Apollo becomes a cautionary tale, not a triumph. People remember the preparation, the astronauts, the effort, but not the victory, because there wasn't one. And the moon? It becomes a monument, not to success, but to missed opportunity. That's a good way to put it. Hovering up there, bright, ancient, silent, but somehow feeling farther away. Not in distance, but in meaning. Every night, a reminder of what we tried to do and didn't. It becomes a backdrop for poetry, for photography, but not for history. And over time, that unrealized dream shapes the American psyche. That post-Apollo confidence we once felt, the belief that government could solve huge problems, that engineers could outthink nature, that progress itself was part of national identity, it never coalesces. Here, by the late 70s, Americans are still ambitious, still innovative, but more inward-looking. Watergate, Vietnam, stagflation, the energy crisis. The moon landing in our world served as a counterbalance to all that, a shining moment of unity and optimism. But here, there's no shared triumph, no iconic image, no turning point to hold on to. Generations grow up without that moment, and for some, that means lower expectations. For others, a quiet bitterness, a sense that the country once aimed high and then stopped. Even NASA changes. It becomes a bureaucracy, capable, respected, known for its science, but not for lighting fires in the national imagination. The museums still tell the Apollo story. The capsule is still there. But the tone is different. Melancholic. What could have been? The black boots that should have stood on the moon. Just a relic now of unrealized hope. And America's mythos of exploration shifts. Inventors still invent. Scientists still discover. But the fire is cooler. The pace slower. The story feels incomplete. The world moves on differently. The Soviets hold on to their early victories. China rises and shapes its own narrative. Europe invests in collaboration, practicality, research, and the US? It becomes just one voice in a growing global chorus. No longer the solo act. No longer the undisputed leader in human spaceflight. Other myths rise to fill the vacuum. Silicon Valley tells a new story. Disruption, algorithms, digital revolutions. It's powerful, no doubt, but somehow narrower, less universal, less human. Because the moon landing wasn't just about America, it was about people. One of the rare moments in modern history when all of humanity looked up and felt part of something bigger, something shared. That's the real loss. Without Apollo 11, we don't just miss a flag in the dust. We miss the myth, the unifying story it gave us, that in one moment, however brief, we had proven we were more than our conflicts, more than our politics, more than earthbound. We had reached the stars, and if we could do that, what else might we do? That question still gets asked in this world, but never with the same hope, never with the same force. In this timeline, the moon is still there, silent, beautiful, but the story we tell about it, and about ourselves, never reaches escape velocity. But here, in our world, we did go. We chose to go. We aimed higher than fear, higher than division. And in doing so, we left behind something far more permanent than boot prints. We left hope. A reminder that the impossible isn't a limit, it's an invitation.